Bush Center is a place that calls people to a higher purpose and aims to inspire service to others. Laura and I believe that to whom much is given, much is required. This is the spirit that guides our work.
The Bush Center is warm and welcoming. Built on the campus of SMU, my alma mater, we invite visitors through our doors to attend public programming that attracts newsmakers and thought leaders for important conversations around the issues we care most about.
The Bush Center is a unique asset. Having a presidential center and institute combined is something that differentiates us from most places around the country. We're able to go where others cannot go and access resources others cannot access. We set our priorities, we envision what success looks like, and then, as President Bush likes to say, we act.
When you walk into the Bush Institute, you'll see a quote from my presidency on the wall that summarizes the principles we're committed to. It is important that we continue to defend these beliefs.
The George W. Bush Presidential Center celebrates the goodness of our nation and pursues with optimism the values of freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion.
Through the work of the George W. Bush Institute, we aspire to show the world America's best. One way we do that is by bringing people together to find solutions that bridge ideology, nationality, and creed. We focus on ensuring opportunity for everyone. We believe that all Americans should have a chance to succeed. That means a quality education and an economy that rewards innovation and replaces poverty with prosperity. We work to advance free societies around the world. Freedom brings responsibility, including a respect for human rights and the rule of law. Ultimately, free societies and free people are the world's best hope for peace and stability. For example, we've screened millions of women in sub-Saharan Africa for cervical cancer. We're working with veterans to get them into high-quality mental health care across the country. We have also developed best-in-class analysis on how to get great leaders in schools nationwide.
Our convening power is unmatched. We bring people to this great facility on this great campus and online through our public programming, our publications, podcasts, and thought-provoking journals.
Having the Bush Center here is really the crown jewel of the campus. Everyone associated with SMU is extremely proud of it.
We are honored to be on this great campus and be able to partner with the SMU community and its world-class faculty, and we've always enjoyed sharing our programs with SMU students and the broader community.
In addition, principled leadership never goes out of style. President and Mrs. Bush have set the example, and we want to follow it.
My hope is that the Bush Center will always serve as a place where timeless principles are celebrated, protected, and promoted. We've had a great start. Now we must make sure our mission endures for generations to come.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you all. Thank you. Welcome. Please be seated. Welcome to yet another NexPoint Engage event. For those of you who are like full-time Engage goers, I hope you have found them interesting up to this point this year. I think you're going to find this one really interesting. Tonight we're kicking off an exhibit next door honoring documents that matter to our history. Here at the Bush Center, we believe that it's important to understand where we've been in order to be able to chart where we're going. And some people, notably Harlan Crow and David Rubenstein, have lent some unbelievably interesting documents as a part of educating, helping educate Americans about the importance of our system. Today we're going to have a discussion about that, and it's going to be led by Ken Hersh, who runs the Bush Center and does a damn good job. And all the employees who work here, thank you for what you're doing, members of the board, advisory committee, on and on. Sponsors for this exhibit, we thank you very much for your generosity. I hope you find it's worthwhile. And Ken is going to talk to two people, one of whom is David Rubenstein. He's the co-founder of Carlyle. For the uneducated, that's a big damn deal. unbelievably successful guy. But you know what he's done? He's given a lot of his wealth to preserving America's treasures. And it's really a generous person who cares deeply about our past and our future. He's also going to be joined by Sharon McMahon, who is a former high school teacher. And like when I read that, like, okay, you know, Laura was a former elementary school teacher. But it turns out that Sharon has got a unique way of helping educate the American people about the importance of our system. She's got 1 million followers. Yeah, it's a lot. And if this doesn't work out for her, she's going to start selling toothpaste to her 1 million followers. At any rate, we're lucky to have David and Sharon with us. Please welcome Ken Hersh, Sharon McMahon, and David Rubenstein.
I usually get a rounding applause like that when I walk in. It happens to you too, David, I bet, all the time.
Not until tonight.
Anyway, thank you all for being here, and thank you, David and Sharon, as well. This is a great opportunity to celebrate our exhibit, and both of you had a hand in the exhibit that will be open for everybody as they leave tonight. David, you were generous to offer and lend to us some very, very important documents that were part of the founding of this country. And collecting those and preserving those and putting them on display is a real gift. And Sharon, the staff, when they went to design the exhibit, they actually listened to some of your podcasts on how to bring this to life. And one of your gifts is translating the theory and the complicated into simple and bringing it to life. And there's some, I don't know if we actually lifted verbiage, but it's probably pretty close.
I'm okay with that.
So anyway, I want to thank you both for being here and contributing. As we get started, I want to start with just the basic inspiration. What you both have in common is a love of history. Where did that come from? Let's start with you, Sharon. Explain that core feeling.
I think it started, of course, I think most people would say, you know, when I was a child. But when I was 12, I had a paper route in northern Minnesota, where I grew up, walking, you know, hours in the dark at 5 o'clock in the morning when it's 30 below. And there was literally nothing else to do but read the newspapers that I was delivering. And I would, you know, surreptitiously try to refold them so the person that I was putting it in the mailbox for didn't know that I had been reading their newspaper. So I can pinpoint that event as something that was really pivotal in my life, that I was reading history as it took place.
And David?
Well, I got better grades in history than I got in other subjects, so that probably was a motivation. As a young man, I had the privilege of serving our country working in the White House. Unfortunately, I managed to get inflation to 19% under President Carter. But when you do work at the White House, you do get a sense of history for sure. And I've lived in Washington for the last 40 years. And I also take credit, I think, not only for having Carter lose the election because inflation was so high, but I think about it this way. If Carter had not lost that election because I got inflation so high, Ronald Reagan wouldn't have been president. And if he hadn't been president, George Herbert Walker Bush wouldn't have been vice president. And if George Herbert Walker Bush hadn't been vice president, he probably wouldn't have gotten to be president. And if he hadn't been president, maybe George W. Bush wouldn't have been president. So I take credit for getting 2 Bushes elected president because so that's my contribution to history.
We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Definitely. All right, history and then reading. Reading, you know, I want to talk about, you emphasize that in a lot in your podcast. And David, that was a big part of your growing up. So I want to talk about reading, what it means to you, and then expand that to a little bit about where you think reading is today. So David, why don't you start with this one?
This is something I care a great deal about. And I chair the National Book Festival for the last 10 years, which was started by the First Lady, and thank you. What happened was at the inauguration of festivities, the night before President Bush was inaugurated, there was a reception, and Jim Billington, who was then the Librarian of Congress, a distinguished Librarian of Congress who served for 28 years, was asked by Mrs. Bush, do you have a book festival here in Washington? We have one in Texas. And he said, thinking quickly, no, but we will. And so this is now about 20 plus years ago. And the National Book Festival is now the biggest book festival in the United States. About 250,000 people come to it each year. It's an incredible thing, and I've been the privilege of being the chair of it for the last 10 years. And the reason I've gotten involved with that, and I chair the Library of Congress's support board, is I came from a very modest family, no wealth, and my parents couldn't afford to buy books, so they would take me to the library. And when I was 6 years old, I got my library card, and you could take out 12 books at a time, and then you have to wait a week to take another 12 out. And so I would read them all the first day, and I had to wait a week to get more books. And so I just came to have a love of reading because, in my view, the best way to kind of, if you have modest circumstances, is to get out and learn more about the world is to read, and reading books. Books are, you know, it's nice to read a tweet, and it's nice to read an email from time to time, but nothing concentrates the brain just like reading a book does. You have to take time, you learn more from it. I now try to read 100 books a year, and I do that by a trick, which I read books about things I know something about, but I interview people about the books, and I think it's a courtesy to make sure that people know that you've read the book that they've taken a lot of time to write. Sadly, in this country, about 30% of the people in this country, adults, are functionally illiterate. Functionally illiterate means they can't read past the 4th grade level. If you can't read past the 4th grade level, you have no chance in our society of getting anywhere. Sadly as well, 2/3 of the people in the federal prison system are functionally illiterate, and 3/4 of the people in the juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate. These people have no chance, really, in my view, of rising up in our society. So to me, the greatest socioeconomic problem we face is not only the income inequality, but the income inequality comes about because so many people cannot read. And I don't mean people who come as foreign citizens to this country and they can read their native language, but they can't read English. I'm talking about people who can't read their native language, and of course they can't read English either. So this is a big problem. It's one of the most serious problems we have to work on, and I'd say President Bush's mother worked a lot on this issue. She created the Barbara Bush Family Literacy Foundation, and it's an incredible thing that she focused on, but this is the reason. Most people learn how to read by having their parents read to them. And if your parents are not there and they can't read, you have a very little chance of learning how to read yourself. Schools are great, but parents really help make it possible for you to read. And sadly, in this country, we have a lot of functionally illiterate people who can't teach their children to read, and so we're condemning ourselves to generations of people that can't read. So to me, reading is the most important thing that enabled me to rise up from a modest circumstance, and I try to encourage people to read as much as possible. 30% of the people who graduate from college in this country never read another book in their life because they're reading magazines or other things. Reading books is really important, and I think we need to do more to encourage our children to read books, not just read, but read books, because books can focus your brain in much better ways than other things that you can read.
And obviously, President Bush's, one of his signature pieces of legislation was the No Child Left Behind, which really encouraged by 3rd grade this to be proficient in reading, because that was really where the curve starts to separate. Sharon, in your experience as a teacher and now interacting with the public, do you feel that we're making some headway?
I mean, in the classroom, literacy is such an enormous issue. It is really difficult to teach high-level content if you can't read it. You know, and this is something that I discovered as a government teacher for many years. It is a unique challenge to try to get students who are 16 years old and read at a 2nd grade level, to teach them really, really challenging concepts about like the Electoral College. If when you give them information to read about it, it's difficult for them to do that.
What did you do?
I mean, this is one of the unique challenges, right? Is learning about how literacy works, how the brain learns to read. But this is, much larger issue than just one classroom teacher teaching government. I can't single-handedly bring all of the children who don't read up to the level, plus teach all of the content that I need to teach. But one of the things tools that I found really helpful in learning vocabulary and learning these sort of very important concepts of government is to use humor. Right? If you can associate it with something funny, if you can laugh, you're much more likely to remember those very challenging vocabulary words.
So was governerds one of your vocabulary words?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have some governerds here today?
They invented that word for themselves.
Themselves?
They did. They invented that name for themselves.
Is there like a poll that was taken?
That is exactly. There was a poll that was taken. I will not tell you in polite mixed company what some of the other options were. But some of you who are here know. And you're glad at this moment that we didn't choose it. Yes.
David, have you ever thought that you were a governerd?
No.
I think
You are now. You are now.
Okay, I think we all are, because we're all here, so thank you. Now, you're bringing it to life orally through podcasts. How is that different, and how do you approach that?
It's different in terms of a podcast in that there are no behavior issues. Right? There is nobody coming in late. But when you are writing a podcast, you're writing the script for a podcast, you know that this information is going to be disseminated widely to millions of listeners. You know, like we have over 1 million people per month that listen to our podcast. So you know that this information you're going to get fact checked, and they will tell you if you said a name wrong, if you pronounced Lancaster, Pennsylvania incorrectly. You're like, they are going to correct you. So the burden of making sure you get it right is extremely high in podcasting. When you're in a classroom, you can be like, listen, his last name was X, and they will just believe you. Right? They'll just believe you. So there is no sense in today's audience that people will just believe you. They will fact check you and let you know. So that's part of it, is that you have to the fact checking has to be extremely stringent. We go through multiple layers of it. But another thing that's important that I found is that creating sort of a multi-dimensional way to learn material is important. I totally agree with David that reading is incredibly important. But if you are not somebody who is willing to sit down and read a David McCullough biography on Harry Truman, you know, which is literally this thick, I recommend it. But if you're not, it doesn't mean you should never have the chance to learn anything about him, right? So this is a way of sort of creating more of a democratic way to access information that, because of literacy issues, not everybody can sit and read a huge novel or a huge book. I'm sorry.
Well, there are people that have something called dyslexia, and you're born with it typically. And you can overcome it and modulate it, but you can't completely eliminate it. And many people have done quite well in life by compensating for it. So some people that have dyslexia learn how to listen much better. They learn how to talk much better. They learn how to compensate for the fact that they can't read. And so I don't want to make it sound like if you can't read, you can't do anything. Of course, reading is essential in our society, I think, but you can overcome the inability to read if you are dyslexic by getting training, and many people do that.
And now, David, you know, in your second career here, besides being an investor and running a great firm, you've become a phenomenal interviewer of personalities, many of whom have written big books. And so in many ways, you are distilling, and then your books are distillations of these great interviews. So when you approach somebody who's written a 500-page tome, and you want to distill it down to a 30-minute Bloomberg interview session, how do you go about picking out where to focus?
As a courtesy, when you're interviewing somebody who's written a book, I think it's good to read the whole book. So recently, I had to interview Beverly Gage, who wrote an 800-page book on J. Edgar Hoover. A great book, but 800 pages, a lot of time. It takes time to get through that. So every time I'm supposed to be doing something else, I'm reading this book. I think what I try to do when I read a book is not take notes on it or not underline. I've found over the years that underlining and taking notes slows down the reading, and it doesn't really lead to much. So after I read the book, whatever I retain in my brain is probably going to be enough to get through a 30-minute interview. And so I'll then write down the questions that occur to me that I think somebody would be interested in, and then I give the questions to the person because I don't want them to relax, not think I'm going to be Mike Wallace, kind of embarrassing them in some ways. And then I can remember them, the questions, because I've written them, and so I tend to not use notes. I don't mind anybody using notes, but I would say, the reason I don't use notes, and people ask me about this all the time, is that my feeling is if you have a conversation one-on-one, obviously it's different two-on-one, but if it's one-on-one, when you have notes in front of you, you use it as a crutch. And what happens is inevitably, you remember everything. You wrote those questions down. If you threw those cards away tomorrow, or right now, you're not going to forget those questions. But so rather than have that crutch there, but your eye will inevitably go down and look at them all the time and lose the eye contact, it's better to remember the questions. If you'll remember 90% of what you wrote, nobody will remember the 10% you didn't. So that's how I do it. And it's worked out okay.
Now, to prep for this, I actually did listen to Sharon's podcast of interviewing you, which I thought was pretty interesting. Do you remember that podcast and some of the hard-hitting questions
I do a lot of podcasts, and sometimes I don't remember all of them, but I'm sure I remember that one.
I'm sure you do.
But
Sharon, do you want to tell us a little bit? These aren't on my cards. I'm just actually going to ask you that.
One of the things that I asked you is why are 70-year-old men still trying to run the country?
Okay. Well,
and do you remember what your answer
there's
is?
nothing wrong with 70-year-old men doing it. It's when they have 80-year-old men. 70's nothing. 70's nothing. I mean, 70, let's give us a 70-year-old. No, I think, look, the truth is, in my generation, baby boomers, we were always the most pampered generation in the sense that we always thought we were the most important because we were the biggest part of the population. And so the baby boomers, my generation, we don't want to get off the stage.
Yes.
We like being in the center of the stage.
That's right.
We've been in the stage for a long time, and we don't want to get off the center of the stage. So today, people who are 70s are running things. People are running for office in their late 70s. People say, okay, it's late 70s, you're not in the mid 80s or anything. So I think the answer is that we enjoy what we're doing, and we want to give back what we can give to society. But interesting that life has changed so much. When people came out of caves 400,000 years ago, the life expectancy was 20. In 1900, the life expectancy in this country was 49. When the Social Security Act was passed in 1934, the life expectancy was 65. Today, depending on ethnicity and other things, life expectancy is in the early 80s in this country. And so we're living longer. That's a bit of a problem in some things for pensions and other things, but we're living longer. And the people who are my age, I'm now 73, an age I remember, anybody remember John Kennedy when he was President of the United States? He was looking like such a young man. He was 43 years old. Well, he had his old man, his father was the guy who, kind of helped fund the things and so forth. I looked it up recently. How old was this old man? He was 71. He's younger than me. I remember telling President Carter, you don't have to worry about getting reelected, despite my inflation going to 19%. You're running against an old man. He's 69 years old. How can Reagan get out of the bed in the morning at 69? Now, I'm 73. And now, we'd love to have a 69-year-old candidate for president, right?
So, speaking of demographics, Sharon, 70% of your followers and listeners are women. How do you explain? Talk to me about that connection, and why do you think that is?
I think it's probably even more than 70%. It's probably closer to 90%. I think some of it is the fact that I am a woman. Right? And so there is, it's a different kind of, energy perhaps that somebody would have watching me online than they would have, watching a male political commentator. I think there in some ways is a familiarity or connection that they feel like they can make to me that perhaps, they wouldn't make to somebody like you. With no offense, no offense. You're probably not putting your hair in curlers in the morning talking about things, right?
Well, I'm lucky to have my hair in the morning, but...
Yeah. And I think there's this sense of like people my age, people who are, I've been 29 for a while now, people who are my age do deeply care about things that are happening in the United States, but they also have very real lives. They also have, they're just nurses in the ER. They're trying to put food on the table. They have these 3 kids that want dinner every single night of the year, 365 days. They have real things that are going on in their own lives. And I think one of the things that I can connect to people on is that sense of you can have both. You can actually care about what's happening in the world, you can care about what's happening in the United States, and you can also care about your kids and your real life and picking up your kitchen and cleaning up the toys. And so I think that's part of it, is that connection.
So now specifically with that connection and around the topics that tie to our exhibit, the freedom and democracy topics around history, you didn't set out to become an influencer and an Instagram and podcast sensation. You hit a nerve around some of the founding elements of this country that people wanted to know more about or wanted to consume differently. How did that come about, and what's your reaction to it?
I mean, it really started when I started noticing a tremendous amount of misinformation on social media. And it was not just, talking heads on cable. It was normal, everyday people posting on Facebook, saying things that were just straight up wrong about, well, when the Electoral College happens, A, B, and C will happen the following day. Things that are just verifiably incorrect. So I started making some little explainer videos that I hoped somebody somewhere would watch and be like, oh, now I get it. And I really focused on making them nonpartisan, fact-based, that I was not interested in trying to convert you to voting for candidate A or candidate B, that I just want you to understand how the system works so that you can make educated decisions for yourself. So that's really the genesis of how all of this got started. But to, sort of the larger point of your question, I think there is a very, very deep exhaustion in this country when it comes to political discourse. People tell me all of the time that they feel exhausted and overwhelmed, and they wake up in the morning and feel, in some cases, distraught or hopeless, like there is, like nothing can ever get better, it can never be fixed. And the conversation surrounding politics is so full of rancor. It's so full of anger. It just, all it is, it seems like to many people, like it's just angry talking heads on TV. And that is exhausting to listen to. So I think one of the things that people in my community have really, enjoy or found useful is that it is possible to have meaningful conversations, fact-based conversations that change people's lives without the vitriol, without devolving into personal insults, and without, without the incredible amounts of anger and vitriol that we see on TV today.
And your messages are, and I've listened to a few, are really they're really optimistic and upbeat, and not condescending in any way. David, you've talked to so many great leaders. Do you think that there's something about being an optimist and being a leader?
Let me address for a moment the history question. Why should we actually study history? Who cares about it anyway? Well, the theory of history is that you learn from the mistakes. A famous Harvard historian once said, those who don't remember history are condemned to relive it. And the essence of that means is we should learn from history. Civilization progresses if you figure out how you made mistakes before and learn from them and don't do them in the future. In this country, we have made almost religious figures out of our founding fathers. Over the years, Washington and Madison, Jefferson, and so forth. In more recent years, we've torn them down. We've said, remember, Washington was a slave owner. Jefferson had an affair for 40 years with one of his slaves. Franklin was a bit of a philanderer, to put it mildly. So we've basically torn them down a bit, but people are still interested in these people because they gave us the country. They made an experiment in representative democracy, which everybody around the world thought could not make or could not work. And even Jefferson said it might last only 20 years. So it worked more or less with 27 amendments to the Constitution, and 17, if you don't count the Bill of Rights. And we've kept this Constitution alive for a long period of time with its flaws and so forth. And the country has had a lot of flaws. We started with a birth defect, slavery, and we're still living with that birth defect to some extent. But learning about the history, how we evolved, helps us, I think, make the country better than it is. And I think everybody should take it upon themselves to say, what can I do in my life to make this country slightly better? And I encourage audiences all the time that I speak to, figure out what you're going to do that's going to make your children and your grandchildren proud of what you've done with your life, and what can you make yourself proud of what you've done with your life. What can you do to give back to this country in some modest way, in some way? You don't have to be President of the United States to give back to the country. You can do something else. Presidents do great jobs, but other people can do other things to help this country, and everybody should try to figure out how we can make this country better, because the country obviously has a lot of challenges. We've been spending most of our history trying to live up to the sentence in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, when Jefferson wrote that when he was a slave owner, and obviously he meant all white Christian property owner men, not everybody, and not all women. So we've been trying to live up to what he probably should have intended to say and maybe written it better, but he wasn't. He was captured by his time. A final point I'd like to make on this whole subject is that, why do we want to preserve documents from our founding fathers? Why do we care about the things in this display? Why should we care about it? We know what the Declaration of Independence says. You can read it on a computer slide, and somebody can give you a Wikipedia rendition of what's in there. Why do we care about actually preserving the documents? Well, it turns out that the human brain is not yet so evolved that you can get the same experience by seeing the text of the Declaration of Independence on a computer slide as seeing it in person. Because when you see it in person, you're going to more likely not prepare for it by reading a little bit before you go see it. After you see it, and when you see it, you're probably going to have a curator tell you about it. And afterwards, it turns out that people will learn more about these things once they've seen the actual document. So why do we, otherwise, the same thing is true with buildings. Why preserve Mount Vernon? Why preserve Monticello? Why preserve Montpelier, Madison's home? Because if you go there and you experience it, you're more likely to have a greater knowledge of our country's history and more likely to become a better informed citizen. The theory about our democracy is we have an informed citizenry, and if we don't have a informed citizenry, we're not going to have as good a democracy. And the final point is that one relating to our knowledge, as you know this very well, right now, if you want to be and is there any naturalized citizen in this country, in this room right now? Anybody a naturalized American? Okay. So to be a naturalized American, you had to be here for 5 years and pass a test. And the test is a citizenship test. It's 100 potential questions. You have to give you 10, and you have to pass 6 of them. If you're 65 or older, they tell you which 10 you're going to get. Okay? Well, it turns out that these naturalized citizen applicants, 91% of the people who take that test pass. 91%, which means they know something about our history. And these questions are things like, how many branches of government do we have in the federal government? Who was our first president of the United States? And things like that. The same test was more or less given to citizens in all 50 states who are natural-born citizens in this country. And only one state could a majority barely pass that. In 49 states, the majority of citizens in that state couldn't pass, which shows you we're not teaching people history and civics very much anymore, and that's a sad situation.
And I think that, Sharon, you have a pretty good pulse on what people are asking and what people care about. Other than Texas seceding, is there a common denominator about where you feel the sentiment is right now?
Well, just for the
David's
record,
point?
Texas cannot secede. Okay, just for the record. I get questions all the way from, existential questions like, what is the meaning of government? What is freedom? Where does freedom come from? And you see some of these same questions echoed in this exhibit. Where does freedom come from? All the way down to, what is a county commissioner? Where somebody feels, like possibly they feel embarrassed about the fact that they don't know the answer to that question. And they can't ask their friends. They're not going to call their friend and be like, what's a county commissioner? Because they're afraid they're going to look dumb, right? And when you Google for these things, like we were saying earlier, if you Google for something, let's say you have a headache and you're like, why do I have a headache? You might get 25 answers, like, it's probably a brain tumor, right? It's probably what it is. And so you don't always know that the information that you have Googled for is legitimate. You don't know that that is, the actual information that you need. So what I have found is that people are hungry for the truth. They want to know what's real. They want to know what facts are. And they have found that being able to ask somebody like me cuts through a lot of the noise, cuts through the idea that like, well, now I need to is this a .gov site? What kind of site is this? It's very difficult sometimes to come up with the succinct answer to a question. What's going to happen if Y happens? So to me, that is a very important part of what I do, is explaining not just the high-level questions about, like, where does freedom come from, but also the basic questions in a way that helps people feel smarter and not more dumb. You know, if I attend a lecture on, nuclear fission, and that is not my field, right? Like, I don't know. And I would probably leave that lecture, if it was like a college class, feeling more dumb because I didn't understand any of the vocabulary. And I'd be like, oh, these people are smart and I know nothing. And that is often how people are left feeling when they are watching the news or they are reading a very high-level newspaper, for example. They feel more dumb after reading it. So my goal is always to help people feel less dumb, more empowered, and more confident in their knowledge that they understand how something works so that they can work to change it. You can't change what you don't understand.
So if
people to me don't keep up with the news as much as I think they used to. I still read newspapers, but now it's very hard to actually find the physical newspapers. Anybody my age and older probably still reads physical newspapers, but it's very hard to find them. And my kids, all of whom are pretty well educated, where do they get their news from? LinkedIn. I mean, or Facebook, that's where they get their news from. You kind of wonder, is that really the same as the New York Times or the Washington Post or other good newspapers? I think we have a history and not in current news deficit because people are not really getting news that much and they're not as interested in reading about what's actually going on in the world, in my view, and I think it's unfortunate.
So here's something that I struggle with. There are a lot of people who are engaged in what's going on. I mean, I see people that your podcasts and your social media is on fire. There's plenty of people on extremes that, you name it, people I think are switched on. So in terms of engagement, that's one thing. Do you think there's a difference, David, between engagement and civic involvement? You think
I think being an engaged citizen to me means you understand the issues that are involved and you're trying to do something to improve the problems, and also you do one thing that sadly we don't do that much in this country, which is the most important thing to be a civically engaged person, which is to vote. Think about it. In this country, roughly 62% of eligible voters vote in presidential elections. In non-presidential elections, you're lucky to get 30 or 40%. So we have people that have given their lives to protect our right to vote, and yet we don't actually exercise our right to vote. And that's a very sad situation. I don't want to go to the situation they have in certain countries like Australia where you pay people to vote or you penalize them if you don't. But we need to make people feel that if you vote, you're really exercising a franchise. It's important. Now, I love it when I see on election day people standing in line for hours. Now, I say, I wouldn't know if I would stand in line for hours. I'd vote early, so I wouldn't have to stand in line for hours. But people stand in line for hours because they realize that one vote can really make a difference. And I think it's important that we exercise that franchise. And it's a franchise that, sadly, when this country was created, really wasn't given to everybody. We had only people who were property owners, Christian property owners, and men were able to vote in the beginning. So, it's amazing. And I wonder all the time, how this country, survived without letting, for such a long time, we didn't let half the population vote. Not to mention people, African Americans couldn't vote. It is amazing. We didn't let women vote until roughly 1919. And it was very difficult to get that done. It was a very complicated vote to get that done. You think about it, and it's also hard to believe that this country is governed by a constitution that was written by white, Christian, property-owning men, and there were a limited number of them representing the rest of the citizens. And now that document is one that all of us are living by. And I wonder what the document would look like today if a really representative group of people in this country were to put together a document. Would it be better or worse? Well, hard to know. We're not going to actually have that. But it is amazing how we are living under a document that is so many years old and written by people, while very intelligent, had different backgrounds than many people in our country.
So do you think now, that's a good segue to this next question that's on my card here, is for Sharon, that you're really focused on getting the facts, okay? And you make that point that there's really, facts are important, and we only deal in facts. Why is it so hard for our population to settle on a common set of facts now?
Yeah, there's that phrase, you can entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own set of facts. You know, I'm not somebody who likes to cast aspersions and point fingers at a specific person and be like, well, it's his fault. That's not my style. But I do think it's a multifaceted question. We can point to, you know, the rise of cable news as one set of examples with that, where, you know, when you have to fill 24 hours a day with something, you're going to fill a lot of it with opinion-based content, right? That's because you have to. You just have to. If you think back to when I was growing up, because to repeat, I am 29 and have been for a while. The news that was available was, you know, your choice of like, you know, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, or Dan Rather, right? Like you pick who do you like the best. You're going to get 30 minutes of news each day, and the story needed to be big enough to make it into that 30-minute news broadcast. You didn't have time to say, and next we have Bob, and Bob's going to tell us all about why Sandra is the worst. You know, like that was not part of the 30-minute news broadcast every night. So I do think that's part of it. I think some of it means the lack of media literacy means that when you are watching news or you're reading an opinion-based article online, it can be difficult to sort out what is somebody's opinion and what is you know, a fact-based article. News, if you go on a news site now, not every news site is even great at labeling what is opinion and what is a fact-based reporting story. So that it contributes even further to the lack of media literacy in the United States. And it's really that the lack of education surrounding media literacy is really at the heart of why we can't agree on facts.
One of the things I'd like people to think about is where the leaders come from in our society. We always have leaders, and it's important that we have leaders because you can't have a country of 330 million people with everybody making every decision themselves. When our country was first started, we had incredibly dedicated people. They were slave owners in many cases, and they were misogynists in many cases, but they were people who were dedicated to trying to make this country a new country and make it as best as they knew how to do it. And you had giants, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, among others. And you have to say today, where are the giants? And that day we had a country of 3 million people, and only about 500,000 of them were really eligible to participate in government. So out of 500,000 people, you had Washington and Adams and Hamilton and people like that. Today, where are the Washingtons, the Hamiltons, the Madisons? Well, my theory is that they're all in private equity. We need to get these people out of private equity into politics. But to be very serious, we need to encourage people to go into public service and elective office because right now you see a lot of people turned off by public service and particularly elective office because the mudslinging is so outrageous and the amount of money you have to raise and time spent raising money is so laborious and unpleasant that you have a situation now, the best people in the country are often not the people who want to run for office. And so it's a sad situation. I think we ought to make some ways to improve it. Right now, I'll take the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, you have 75 members of the House who cannot afford to have an apartment in D.C., so they live in their offices, which is illegal, but they're doing it because they can't afford it. We don't pay members of Congress adequately because they're afraid to have a salary increase, so we're paying them the same amount of money we paid them 20 years ago. And it's very difficult to live, and that way you also don't attract people who really are going to be some of the citizens that can afford to make these sacrifices. So I think we ought to do much more to encourage really good people to go into government and pay them adequately to do so.
So, David, now Virginia actually did take a private equity guy and made him governor. Right. So maybe there's a trend there. Congress today has a 12% approval rating, which would be unacceptable to just about every other industry, and yet that seems to perpetuate. Why do you think you spend a lot of time, you've written a book on it, assembling your conversations with great leaders. Why do you think, and I'll add, in the museum, we have other great names like Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King. There have been more contemporary great people that step up against the tide and have their voice rise above. What is it that in today's world makes a great leader?
Well, a great leader is somebody that's willing to take on challenges, who's willing to basically go against the conventional wisdom, to basically be willing to say, this is how I think we should move forward, when it's not necessarily the most popular thing to do so. It's easy to say everybody should do something that everybody agrees on, but taking the conventional wisdom and going against it, or going against the common grain, is not easy to do, because today, in the era of social media, you'll be really vilified dramatically by people in a way that didn't exist before. When I was in the White House, you had 15 minutes of evening news. Walter Cronkite was on 15 minutes a night. You had 2 or 3 newspapers people paid attention to. There was no social media. The vilification wasn't so great. And while I don't want to make it sound like it was Pollyannish kind of time and it was an era of good feelings, it wasn't quite as bad today. Today, you kind of destroy people's reputations so quickly that people say they don't want to participate in this kind of food fight anymore, and it's a sad situation. If I had the solutions for this, I would be in Iowa, New Hampshire, and so forth. I don't have the solutions for it, but it's a sad situation, and there are some countries that seem to be able to do it somewhat better than us, with some minuses they all have, but I do worry that the best people in the country will say, I don't want to be in public service anymore. And when that happens, you're going to get second-rate people, and then you're going to get a second-rate government. And so I really encourage people to encourage others to get into government and to public service. And everybody, I think, should try to do something in public service at some point in their life, give back to the country that made it possible for them to be where they are.
That also speaks to something that I think all Americans have the responsibility to do. Like, we like to vilify the media, and we like to be like, well, it's those people. Those people exist because we click on their websites. They exist because we are giving them our time and attention. And our time and attention is something that every single one of us can control. And if we want to change the conversation about, what is important to discuss, how are we willing to treat each other, what are we willing to tolerate, we need to stop giving them our time and attention. And when our time and attention diminishes is when that conversation can begin to change in a more significant way. So this is something that everybody can choose to do. They can choose not to click on what is a clickbaity story. You can choose, exactly how you'll consume your news. Maybe it's you get the Wall Street Journal delivered every day and you read it in the newspaper form, and you stop spending time giving your time and attention to the people who make tremendous amounts of money from fueling divisiveness in the United States.
Well, one of the problems today is the amount of money it takes to run for office is staggering. And
it's staggering.
Members of Congress spend 40%, members of the House spend 40% of their time raising money. Why do they raise so much money? Well, the person who has the most money usually wins.
That's right.
The person who has the most money in the bank usually scares off opponents. The person who has the most money in the bank can take some of the money to help buy subcommittee and committee chairmanships, because seniority doesn't rule all the time anymore, and you can keep the money. Legally, under our system, if you have excess campaign money, you can't use it for personal purposes, but you can use it for political purposes. So you can hire, a friend of yours to be your political advisor, or you could rent your own house as a campaign headquarters. So essentially, you can keep the money. So that's why members of Congress are constantly raising money. And to raise money, you cannot raise money easily by saying, look, I'm going to go to Washington. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to be right down the middle. I'll listen to the left. I'll listen to the right. But whatever is right down the middle, that's what I'm going to be. That will raise you no money. You have to appeal to the far left or the far right, and that's where the money is. And that's why you often have this division now. I've started a program in Congress to educate members of Congress about American history on the theory that maybe the people that are making the laws should know more about American history. So once a month for the last 7 years, I interview a great American historian, John Meacham or somebody like that, in front of only members of Congress. And I ask them if they come to sit with somebody from the opposite party in the opposite house. There's no press there. And the members tell me, sadly, this is the most interesting thing they're doing in Congress. Sadly, because they should be doing more interesting things. But members like it because they have no opportunity any longer to be in a non-political setting where they can talk to people from the opposite party and the opposite house. And they don't really know each other so much. There are no more congressional delegations called junkets where they get to bond with each other. There are no more conference committees because there's no legislation anymore. So the members from each house don't know each other anymore. And now it's considered to be a bad thing to socialize with somebody from the opposite party. So it's a sad situation now that we depend on money so much for the politics, and you raise it only from the far left and the far right, and trying to be in the middle doesn't usually work.
And David, do you think our democracy is at risk? Do you think our democracy is at risk for the elements you just talked about? Both of you just talked about.
Well, in every generation, people always say this is the worst of times. People always say that. And George Washington's father told him, look, you know, your generation's not going to do anything for this country. You guys are going to run down the country. Everybody tells everybody that my generation tells the younger generation the country's falling apart or something's bad. And that's true of all countries and all civilizations. People have been doing that for thousands of years. Is our democracy at risk? I think our democracy that we've idealized, the one we want to have, is at risk. We will probably keep the government we have, but we're not likely to have it as, in many ways, as good as I think it can be. And so I do worry that today, because of social media and other things, people can get so riled up that they do things like we saw on January the 6th, and maybe we'll see again. And I think that's a sad commentary, and it destroys our reputation around the world. It's hard for us to go to people around the world and say, you should have a democratic government. Look at what we have in the United States. When they see what we have in the United States, it's hard to kind of sell that to people. And unfortunately, we're losing the ability to be the honest broker. You saw that China was now able to broker a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Those are the kind of things we used to be able to do, but I don't think people trust us quite as much as they once did, sadly.
Sharon, how about your thoughts?
In some ways, democracy is at risk. And I totally agree with you, David, that everybody thinks this is the worst of times, right? Every current generation thinks the coming up generation is the worst, like kids these days, and this trashy music, right? Like, if I have to hear about trashy music, I've heard that every day of my life. So that is an absolutely very common sentiment, that this is the worst it has ever been. And often people who say that have not studied history, because we can point them to about 600 times when it's been much worse than it is now, right? But I do think this is a pivotal moment in the United States. Not that we are in risk of overthrowing our government and installing a king, not that. But I do think that this is the moment that historians will look back on, and they will be able to ascertain this is the moment that America turned its face towards democracy and freedom, or it turned away from it. It turned away from democracy and freedom and towards authoritarianism. And this is a moment that we as Americans must decide what is important to us. And my position has always been that the principles of democracy must transcend any party allegiance. I don't care if you voted for the flying spaghetti monster. Your allegiance must be to the principles of democracy before you have an allegiance to any individual, any candidate, any person, or any red or blue party. And we all have the ability to make that choice in this moment. Will we turn towards democracy? And there are a variety of ways that we can support that. Voting is a huge one, clearly. People tell me all the time, though, that like, don't you have any ideas besides voting? You know, like, I already do that. What are your ideas besides voting? But I fervently maintain that we all have an important role in this American experiment, and that we all can do something where we are with the resources available to us. David has different resources than I do, okay? He probably has different resources than most of y'all. So his role is different than mine, right? And that's actually fantastic. I don't need to feel bad that his resources are different than mine. I have a different role, and what I do is also important. It's not everybody's role to have a large social media platform. It's not everybody's role to be the first lady. It's not everybody's role to be on stage interviewing people, but everyone can do something, and everyone should do something where they are with the resources available to them.
You know, in democracy, the United States has successfully persuaded the world that letting people vote is a good thing. So in countries where their voting doesn't mean anything, they still go through the charade of it. So in Russia, in China, in other countries that are not real democracies, they let people vote. Why do they let people vote? Because obviously the idea has taken hold that letting people decide the future is theoretically a better course of government. Now, clearly China is not a democracy, but we have persuaded people that letting people to vote is at least symbolically a good thing. Unfortunately, because the way so many governments are run, a very small number of people in this world, there are roughly 8 billion people now, probably less than 1 billion people actually live in real democracies where their vote really makes a difference. And I think it's shrinking, not getting bigger. And unfortunately, more and more, the population growth in the world is greater in countries that do not have real democracies. And at the current demographic trends, we will be a much smaller percentage of the world's population soon that actually has real democracies. Basically, Western Europe, United States, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, a few other countries have real democracies. But we're shrinking as a population percentage of the world. And at some point, I think it'll be more common that very few people actually think democracy is such a great thing to even let people vote. Remember, if you go to some countries in the world, they do not think that democracy is such a wonderful system. You go to Abu Dhabi, you go to Saudi Arabia, China, most parts of China, they don't actually think that democracy is such a wonderful system. They're reasonably happy with the system they have. So we've lost the game a bit in trying to convince people that it's better to make the world safe for democracy. But I think we have to make sure that we have to make the United States safe for democracy.
Great. So before we wrap up, that brings me to what I like to end with, which is my lightning round. Short answers, usually one word. David, if democracy were a stock, would you be long or short?
I would probably be short on it right now.
Sharon, long or short?
I'd have to go with short.
Okay. David, other than presidents named Bush, which U.S. president do you admire the most?
Well, there's a long gap between the Bushes and everybody else, but I'd say the greatest president of the United States, other than the two Bushes, I would say was Abraham Lincoln, because he held the country together in a time when very few people actually wanted to be held together. And while we lost 600,000 people to the war, I think the country's better off for having stayed united. And so he did it, and he didn't do it in a boastful way. He didn't say, you know what, guess what, I just saved the country, I won the Civil War. He was a man of great humility, and I think humility is something we should also admire when you find some people that have it. Some leaders don't have humility, but I think humility is a great virtue.
Good. And Sharon, who's your least favorite president?
Well,
That's an inside joke
how much
for people
time
that-
do you have for me to tell you about why Andrew Jackson is the worst?
All right, well, quickly, I'm sure there are 2 million people out there who know that. Okay, David, if Carlyle had not worked, what profession do you think you would have been in?
Well, I would have gone back to what I was educated to, be a lawyer, and that's probably what I've done, but I probably would have done what most lawyers in Washington do. They go in and out of government and keep getting jobs, you know.
Sharon, if you weren't a teacher, what do you think you would have been?
Probably a librarian.
A librarian, okay. David, who was your toughest interview?
My toughest interview was probably, well, I would say when somebody doesn't want to be interviewed, that's very tough. I won't mention, but there's a couple business people I've interviewed who didn't want to be interviewed. Somebody talked them into it. They'd never been interviewed on television before, and they showed it. But I would say one of my best interviews ever was President Bush and Bill Clinton.
Right
we
on the
did it
stage.
here, and it was very funny. It's a lot of people still watch it. It was a really good look at what it means to be a former president and so forth. And they have obviously a great relationship, and it showed.
Great. Sharon, what interview do you want to do that you have yet to arrange?
The people in this audience will tell you that I have 2 dream guests on my podcast, and that is simultaneously Michelle Obama and George W. Bush at the same time.
Okay. We're almost done. What teacher in your career, in your education career, had the biggest impact on you?
I had a teacher in high school, large public high school, 1,500 people in my class. It was very large. One guidance counselor, but I had one English teacher who actually taught me how to write the King's English in a way that you could read what I write and understand it. And I try to encourage young people to learn how to write, because so many people graduating from very good schools, they come in, they write memos for me, and they're somewhat illiterate. And so I really think the writing skill is one that I'm pleased that I got from a teacher in the 10th grade in Baltimore.
Okay, and Sharon, your teacher, the biggest impact?
I'd have to go with my 1st grade teacher, Miss Cantner, who I later went on to, babysit her children. But I was a very strange child. I was a weird child, and I was not like the other children. And she was really one of the first people that I felt like understood me.
Okay. David, is President Biden a good house guest?
Well, actually, the answer is I'm not there when he's there.
Okay.
But I would say when the last time I was there, some drone crashed into the back porch, and when the Secret Service has drones and they crash in your back porch, you have to pay for it. So, but no, he's a very nice person. But I'm not there. I lend him my house, but I'm not there.
Okay, and Sharon, what is your opening word in Wordle?
I mean, it's supposed to be adieu, right? Like that's supposed to be the correct answer.
What is yours?
I don't play Wordle anymore.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right. Okay, with that, I do want to wrap up and say thank you to two very, very impactful Americans who we are honored to have on our stage and to help kick off this wonderful exhibit. What I take away is that reading is fundamental. Always learn. And we all have a responsibility to our own democracy to make it better, and you two make it better every day. So join me in thanking David and Sharon. I'd like to thank. You're getting a standing ovation. That doesn't happen all the time. That's for you. This is Governor. I want to thank NexPoint for endowing Engage at the Bush Center. Next up in our series, we have a very special Engage, our annual Laura Bush Book Club. This year, we're focusing on To Kill a Mockingbird. The date is May 8th. And we have a special announcement that Mary Badham, who played Scout in the 1962 film, who is also part of the onstage production, which will be at the Dallas Musicals, the Broadway in Dallas at that exact same time, will be here on May 8th. The museum exhibit, Freedom Matters, will be open on your way out. Sharon will be there greeting our guests. And please don't forget on your way out also as you go through the museum store where copies of 2 of David's books will be on sale. Thank you all for coming, and we really want to also say welcome to a new audience that we've welcomed here tonight who may be more podcast listeners than Bush Center visitors. So we're glad to welcome you here and hope to see you again. Thank you.